knowledge that there was coming a famine, Egypt was the only place in the whole land where there was still food. And so these brothers make the journey to Egypt, and Joseph looked like an Egyptian. And so they come before Joseph, not realizing it was Joseph, and ask him for grain. And through a series of events, Joseph ends up revealing himself to his brothers. And if you remember the story, he ends up bringing all of his family, Israel and all of his brothers, all end up coming and settling down in Egypt, where they could be well taken care of by Joseph. And if you remember that, at the end of Joseph's life, his brothers are getting really nervous because his dad's about to die, and they're sure, once dad's gone, Joseph is going to retaliate for all the evil we did to him and selling him into slavery. But if you remember, Joseph shares with his brothers, what you meant for evil, God meant for good, for the deliverance of an entire nation. And that's an incredible thing. We did a whole retreat off of that, and it's so amazing because that meant so much to me. Because the reality of it is that so often we do not understand why we're going through things we're going through. We look back in our life and say, Lord, how could you allow this? This has been so hard. This is so not what I thought it was going to be when I was having dreams as a young child of, my brother got young, but I didn't know I'd have to go through all these years of pain to get there. But at the end of his life, he could look back and he could see God's hand on his life, and he could say to his brothers, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. God had a plan all along for my life. And the plan was that he would use Joseph to deliver the nation of Israel. And then it goes on as we continue to move on. The Bible tells us that there arose a Pharaoh in Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he began to treat the Israelites cruelly, and he began to enslave them. And they were having to do hard labor, and they had to throw their babies in the Nile River, if you remember that story. But then the Bible tells us about a special child named Moses. His parents gave birth to Moses and said that they recognized that he was a beautiful child and that God had a plan for him. And the Bible says that by faith, his parents hid him for 3 months. And then they made a little ark out of a basket, and they covered it in pitch, and they put their 3-month-old little baby into the Nile River in this little basket. And if you were God's hand, directed that basket right to Pharaoh's daughter's palace. And Pharaoh's daughter's palace sees this little basket with this 3-month-old little Jewish baby, and her heart has compassion on him, and she raises Moses as her own son. And so here he is being trained up in Pharaoh's palace. And the Bible tells us that he was full of all the Egyptian wisdom, that they trained him in all of their ways. And the Egyptians were so wise, we can't even today figure out some of the stuff that they did. We can't even figure out, we tried to recreate what they did, and we missed it by a few days. With all of our computers and modern technology, they were very wise people. So here, where we're picking up the story today, is right in the middle of Moses' life, beginning in verse number 23. It says, now when Moses was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed, and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, and they did not understand. And the next day he appeared to 2 of them as they were fighting, and tried to reconcile them, saying, men, you are brethren, why do you harm one another? But he who did his neighbor wrong pushed him away, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you did the Egyptian yesterday? Then at this saying, Moses fled and became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. Here's Moses. He's 40 years old. He's been raised in Pharaoh's house up to this point, and he knew at the age of 40 that God was going to use him to deliver the nation of Israel. And he goes one day and sets out to visit his brethren, and an Egyptian is treating an Israelite cruelly, and it says that they got in a fight, and Moses ends up killing the Egyptian. Well, the next day he goes back, and now 2 Israelites are fighting each other, and Moses is trying to reconcile them, saying, hey, you brothers, what are you doing? Why are you wronging each other? And they say, who are you? Who made you a judge and a ruler over us? Are you going to kill me like you killed that Egyptian yesterday? And after being rejected, and Moses is scared, he turns around and he runs to the desert of Midian. And Midian is in the middle of the desert, and he lived there for 40 years, Moses does. And he ends up, when he gets there, meeting a man named Jethro, and ends up marrying Jethro's daughter Zipporah, and has 2 kids. And he spends the next 40 years herding cattle, or herding livestock. We don't know what he was herding, but herding livestock in the middle of the desert. And it's funny because he was already trained in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So he was already really smart, but now God's saying, okay, now you got to go my training, okay? Now I have to take all of that and train you for what I am going to do with you. And it took 40 years for God to do that in Moses. But the reality is that God is going to use every single thing that Moses had to go through in the desert to train him God's way, to teach him the lessons that God needed him to learn before he was going to fulfill his call as being the deliverer of Egypt. And he was teaching him humility. He was teaching him how to be a leader. As he had to herd livestock, it was teaching him about leading people and in the right directions and all these kind of things. God is working in Moses' heart through all of that. And the reality of it is that I think we can all agree none of us like desert seasons in our lives. You know, oftentimes we find ourselves in this place where we feel like things have not gone the way they were supposed to. I tried to do what God told me to do. They didn't let me, and now here I am, living in the middle of the desert, you know, with all these livestock. What happened? Where did I go wrong? And we don't like those seasons, but the reality of it is that it is through those desert seasons in our lives so oftentimes that God is doing such an amazing work of preparation in our hearts. Because you know what? He's still got to trim off some rough edges. And he's got to teach us humility. And he's got to teach us how to be a leader. And he's preparing us through that. And I'm sure for Moses, there were years where he probably thought, God must have totally forgotten about me. God must not really even want to use me anymore to deliver the children of Israel. Because he wasn't there a few years, people. He was there 40 years. How many days, how many months do you think he spent wondering, did God put me on a back shelf? Is he not going to use me anymore? Because here I am, still in the middle of the desert, 25 years later, 30 years later, 40 years later. But you know, in God's economy, he didn't waste 1 minute, or hour, or month, or year of Moses' life. He was using that entire time in the desert to prepare him for the huge job that Moses had to do. Because the reality of it is that God did need to do some special training for Moses, because Moses is going to go stand before the most powerful man on the face of the earth and demand that he let his slaves go. And then God is going to use Moses to do miracles that would mesmerize a whole nation. And he's going to use Moses to become the first pastor figure in the entire Bible and lead a nation out of bondage and into God's promised land. So he had a huge job to do, and he's training him through this season in the wilderness. And you know what? I'm really glad that God decided to send people to the desert to train them, because this is how I met my husband. Those of you who don't know our story, my husband Chris was born and raised in LA and got saved at 20. And God called him to the middle of nowhere, according to him, in Yucca Valley, California, to a tiny little Bible college that was taking place in Sky Valley Desert Retreat. But it was during those years of Chris being in the desert where he was washing dishes, cleaning toilets, changing sheets, serving people meals. It was through those 2 years in the desert, in the middle of nowhere, according to him, that God was doing an amazing work in Chris's life. And preparing him and instructing him in what he needed to do, which was to be a servant, to be a pastor. He had to go through this year in the desert to humble him, to teach him to learn how to be a servant. And that's what Moses did. Only Moses wasn't at the desert Bible college for 2 years. He was there for 40 years. And so, Chris said maybe that's wrong with me. I needed 38 more years. But the reality is that, you know what? Some of you may feel like you're in Yucca Valley. You're in the middle of nowhere. You're in this desert place. You don't know why you're here. You don't know what God's purpose is for having you here. But you have to understand that no time today is going to God's heart. If you are here, God has a reason for you being here. If you're here in the middle of nowhere in Yucca Valley, and maybe the military puts you here, or maybe your husband's work brought you here, whatever it may be, this may be, according to your desert phase. But if we will allow the Lord, He will use this time in our lives to train us and to teach us and prepare us for what He has planned for us in the future. And maybe you might hear in Yucca Valley, you're just going through a desert season in your soul, where you're like, Lord, do you hear me? Do you even know that I'm still here? I know at one time in my life that a plan for me, but do you still want to use me? You know what? If He could be using this time in your life to prepare you for what lies ahead, and so for us, He does not waste time. He has a plan for life. He had a plan for Moses' life, and it included 40 years in the middle of the desert, training him for what he was going to do with him. It goes on to verse number 30. And when 40 years had passed, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. When Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight as he drew near to observe. The voice of the Lord came to him, saying, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses trembled and dared not look. And then the Lord said to him, take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their groanings and have come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send you to Egypt. And so after 40 years of being in the desert Bible college, being trained by God, God now talks to Moses from a burning bush. And he tells him, all right, Moses, you're ready now. You're ready to fulfill the purpose that I had for you 40 years ago. And he goes on to tell him, he says, take off your sandals because where you're standing is holy ground. And I love it because the Lord speaks to beautiful words here to Moses. He says, I have seen the oppression of my people. I have heard their cry. And I have come to deliver them. And I love that. Because you know what? The reality of this is the Bible tells us about the Lord that He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so whatever it is that you're going through, the children of Israel were going through an excruciatingly hard time in their history. They were being treated unfairly and cruelly and going through horrible, horrible things. And yet here, God says, I'm ready. I heard them, and I am coming to deliver them. And the reality is that we are going to go through seasons in our lives where things are very difficult, not going the way we want them to go. And sometimes we feel like we're going through them all alone. Nobody really understands what you're going through. And maybe you don't even feel like the Lord hears you. But He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I see my people. I hear their cries. And I am coming to deliver them. And His deliverance is always in His perfect timing. Do you know that the nation of Israel has been in bondage 400 years? That's longer than the United States has even been a nation, okay? That's a long time to be in bondage. But you know what? God has not forgotten about His people. He said, I see them, I hear them, and I'm coming to deliver them in my perfect timing. As you look at this story, and you read the account where the Lord actually appears to Moses and He says these things, Moses is obviously nervous about going back to the children of Israel. He said, listen, God, I already tried that once, and they rejected me. They said, who are you to be a ruler and a judge over us? What is going to change? How do I know that when I go back there, they're not going to reject me yet again? And also he has to go stand before Pharaoh. How hard would that be to go stand before the most powerful man in the world and say, yeah, you got to let these people go because God said so. You know, that's a huge job. And he said, Lord, I need to know who it is that is sending me. I have to be able to tell them who is sending me. You know what God said? Tell them I am. Tell them I am is sending me. And that great word I am means I am your all in all. I am fill in the blank. I am your strength. I am your deliverer. I am your comforter. I am your provision. I am the all in all. I am everything that you will need. And I love that title of the Lord because you know what? So oftentimes I need to be reminded. Because you know what? Sometimes I need provision, sometimes I need strength, sometimes I need wisdom, sometimes I need whatever. He is my I am. He is that great I am in our life. And that's what he told Moses. Listen, Moses, I am. I'm everything you are going to need to do what I've called you to do. Whatever it is that you're going to need for tomorrow, for right now, for this minute, I am it. And I think if you and I would keep that in mind, that we still serve the great I am. And you know what? It's not always easy to do what God has called you to do. Oftentimes, it is very, very difficult to do what God called you to do. And you may be scared to do what God called you to do. Because maybe you tried it before, maybe you got rejected, or maybe it's just scary to take that step of faith. But you know what? He said, listen, if I've called you to do it, I've equipped you to do it, I've already trained you to do it, I am going to be all that you need. I am that all in all, that all-sufficient one who is whatever you need to do what I've called you to do.